Good morning, or depending on when you're listening to this, good afternoon, good evening, or good night. My name's Ross, and I was always told how to voice radio, so today I'm going to be showing you another history lesson of the Pokémon Trading Card Game. We're going to be looking at the best cards from Triumphant. Now, a couple of honourable mentions before we get going. Firstly, Mamoswine, just because, Mamoswine. Secondly, Sharpedo, which was a really fun Pokemon because of that attack Strip Bear. 1 Dark Energy, 20 damage, flip 2 coins. If both of them are heads, your opponent discards all cards from his or her hand, making your opponent play in top deck mode, which was a lot of fun. Now, this was never played a huge amount. It was a gimmicky kind of deck, but you only had a 1 in 4 chance of actually hitting 2 heads, unless you played the later released V-Flip or Victory Star Victini, in which case you had a 1 in 4 chance, but you got to take that chance twice. I'm not saying it was a particularly good Pokemon, because it wasn't, but oh my goodness, wasn't it fun. And while we're here, I should mention that there was also a Slowking released with Second Sight, which said that you could look at either player's deck and rearrange the top 3 cards. So you could use Sharpedo to discard all of the cards in their hand, and then you could use Slowking to make sure that they did not top deck anything good until they were stuck with 3 good cards on their deck, and then you didn't really have much of a choice. Either way, it was a fun little deck that was never particularly good, but it was fun. Also getting an honourable mention is Rescue Energy, because, well, when a Pokemon got KO'd, you got to put that Pokemon back into your hand. You lost the energy and tools and all of that, but you got the Pokemon back. Saw a little bit of play here and there, in Stage 2 decks, you could go ahead and just keep all of the Pokemon. It saw play here and there, but it was never a huge staple card. Now, we're getting into a little bit of cards that maybe should have made the top 10, but Triumphant, we're not talking Unleashed here, ladies and gentlemen. This was a good set. Electrode Prime. And we're looking at the ability here, Energy Might. You can knock out Electrode. Your opponent gets surprised because he's knocked out. Look at the top 7 cards of your deck, attach as many energy cards, and it was energy, not just basic energy, as you like, to any of your Pokemon in any way that you like, and discard the rest. It was great energy acceleration. You would go down a prize, but as we'll see in a minute, it actually comboed really nicely with Twins. And this was used in decks with cards like Cobalion and Terrakion to get these otherwise quite energy heavy Pokemon going quite quickly. It also meant you could play a huge range of energy, including 4 Rainbow, and have a real range of attackers, so you could hit for weakness with pretty much anything. It was a deck that a lot of people liked, but it was never particularly great, and I don't want to put it in the top 10. Sorry about that. And the last honourable mention goes to Gengar Prime, a Pokemon that was supposed to be absolutely game-breaking with this Lost World Stadium. Lost World basically said if you have got 6 Pokemon in the Lost Zone, you can go ahead and just declare that you win the game. Very nice. Problem was, of course, that you had to get those Pokemon in there, and one of the ways you would do that was with Gengar Prime. He had his Hurl into Darkness attack for 1 Psychic Energy, which let you look at your opponent's hand, choose a number of Pokemon up to the number of Psychic Energy attached to Gengar, put them in the Lost Zone. 1 Psychic Energy, 1 Pokemon from the hand into the Lost Zone, and so on. Of course, this didn't just put Pokemon in the Lost Zone, it also meant you could get rid of your opponent's, Stage 2 Pokemon, meaning they couldn't get their Pokemon out and rolling. It also had a Pokebody Catastrophe. If Gengar's active, instead of knocking out Pokemon, you put them in the Lost Zone. But the only real attack he had was Curse Drop, that dropped 4 damage counters for 2 energy, which wasn't great. I should probably at this stage mention what the Lost Zone was. This was a mechanic which I believe technically still exists, although it's not used very much. And, it is a history lesson after all. And the Lost Zone was like a second discard pile, but it was called the Lost Zone because you didn't have cards that recovered from the Lost Zone. When things went to the Lost Zone, they were gone, ladies and gentlemen. You were not getting them back. It was a fun little mechanic that really kind of came to a head in Triumphant. Now, As with all of these top 10 lists, they are open to interpretation. What I will say is I played a lot of Pokemon when Triumphant was legal. I was playing when Triumphant was released. I was playing when Triumphant was rotated out and was no longer legal for tournament play. I played for the entire duration of Triumphant. That does not mean that I am an expert on everything Triumphant, but it does mean that when I say these are the top cards from Triumphant, I have a bit of knowledge to fall back on. Maybe you can argue with the order a little bit. Maybe you thought Gengar or Electrode should have made the top 10. I think David Hockman might say that Gengar should have, but I'm fairly confident that we are mentioning the best cards from Triumphant, and I'm happy with that. So in at number 10, Black Belt, a supporter that could only be played if you were behind, if you had more prize cards remaining than your opponent, you did 40 more damage. Now, given cards like Crobat G that dropped 10 damage has been so good. Muscle Band that did 20 extra damage has been so good. When all of those cards are so good, a card that did 40 extra damage, oh my goodness, that was good. And let's not forget that Junk Arm, which will be coming up later, was a thing which meant that reusing Black Belt was quite easy. In at number 9, another supporter which was pretty gosh darn nice, Seeker. Now, there were 3 real uses I find for Seeker, although I'm not saying these were the only ones. First of all, it could reuse ability, so something like an Uxie, for instance. Play down Uxie, draw up to 7, pick up the Uxie. To put it another way, you would use it like you would use an AZ nowadays, but you get to keep all of the Pokemon and all of the cards attached to them, whereas AZ just lets you keep the Pokemon. It also made your opponent pick up a Pokemon, and that's where other uses come in. For instance, your opponent's got an active and 1 benched Pokemon. You play Seeker to make them pick up the bench Pokemon, knock out the active, they have no Pokemon on the field, and you win. Machamp from Stormfront was a terrible Pokemon for this, because it had that takeout attack that got an instant KO on any basic Pokemon. Combined with Seeker, it meant you could donk your opponent, knock out their only Pokemon on turn 1, even if they had 2 Pokemon in the active. And this happened to me at a tournament. It didn't make me happy. You could also use Seeker with Vileplume, pick up Vileplume, and then use all of your trainers, and then use Broken Time Space to put Vileplume back into play so your opponent cannot play trainers. I suppose you could also use Seeker in a fun little way where if your opponent had a Pokemon on the bench that they'd attached a whole bunch of energy to, or a stage 2 or something like that, you play Seeker, force them to pick it up, put them back by a turn or 2. In at number 8, Machamp Prime. Now, I'm willing to believe that some people are going to think I've put Machamp a little bit high. I'm okay with that. Machamp Prime was a very good Pokemon because he had the Poké Power fighting tag. Once during your turn, if Machamp's on the bench, you move all the fighting energy attached to your active Pokemon to Machamp, and then switch Machamp with the active Pokemon. Might remind you a little bit of the more recent Dragonite EX. And then you would use Crushing Punch, 60 damage for free energy, and discard a special energy attached to the defending Pokemon, or Champ Buster for 4 energy, 100 damage, plus 10 more for each bench Pokemon that has damage counters on it. Now, remember back then that the amount of HP Pokemon had was much, much lower. SP Pokemon generally had somewhere around 110, and even these big Stage 2 primes like Machamp only had 150 HP. 150 at the time was very, very big indeed. And this deck would use Seeker as well. You would Fighting Tag in a Machamp and use Seeker to reuse, to heal that Machamp, and then just place him down again. Popular partners for Machamp included Vileplume, block trainers while just Fighting Tagging and Seekering all of your Machamps, and Donphan. Just because Donphan was a quicker Pokemon that attacked for 1 energy, and then Machamp could Fighting Tag in and do bigger damage with an attack like Champ Buster. I liked Machamp, although personally I played Donphan Machamp, and then I ended up dropping the Machamp. At number 7, Alf Lithograph, a very strange card that if you weren't playing at the time, you might not remember. But I think it was for 4 sets in a row, including this one, for the HeartGold SoulSilver sets, there was 1 Alf Lithograph per set. And you would only get this, I think it was 1 every 3 boxes or something like that. Once every 3 boxes, you would get 1 of these cards. Although I bought a box of Triumphant, pulled an Alf Lithograph, and was very happy. Now, it is actually a readable card. It's just written in Alf lithographs, in the Alf Pokemon, in the unknowns, if you will. Look at all of your face-down prize cards. It is there if you look nice and closely. Now, we used to have As-Alf, and everyone loved As-Alf because it let you look at your prizes and, take a Pokemon out of them. And everybody loves Town Map nowadays because you get to see your prizes. Well, there was a time, ladies and gentlemen, that the only way to look at your prizes, or at least the best way to look at your prizes, was using this particular Pokemon, and not this Pokemon card, using this Alpha Lithograph to go ahead and look at your face down prize cards. So it really was a good thing. Now, Time Walk was a little bit better because it meant you can look at all of your face down prize cards and switch a Pokemon for a card in your hand, whereas Alpha Lithograph just let you look at them. But of course, it meant that you were able to know which your prize cards were, so you could go ahead and make sure you drew the card you wanted. We also had the mischievous trick Rotom from Undaunted. You could switch one of your face down prize cards with the top card of your deck. So of course you use Alpha Lithograph to look at your prize cards, find the card that you really don't want in your prizes, and use Rotom's mischievous trick to switch it with a top card of your deck to take it out of your prizes. An example of a deck that really used this to great effect was the Durant Mill deck. You really need 4 Durants in play to make the best use of this particular deck, so you would use a combination of Alpha Lithograph and Rotom to make sure that you would go ahead and have all of those Durants in play. In at number 6, we have Yanmega Prime and his Pokebody Insight. Remember, Pokebodies were passive, always on. Poker powers were active things that you had to use. Nowadays, they're all abilities. If you have the same number of cards in your hand as your opponent, you attack for free. So you would use cards like Judge or Copycat. Judge makes both players grab 4 cards. Copycat lets you grab as many cards as your opponent has. Both made sure you had the same amount of cards. And then Linear Attack did 40 to one of your opponent's Pokemon, and Sonic Boom did 70 to the active. Though remember that Sonic Boom does not get affected by weakness, which is a little bit sad because sometimes you want to hit for weakness. And don't forget, this was the era of baby Pokemon, which means Linear Attack was enough to KO a baby Pokemon on the bench, but it also meant if your opponent used a Cleffa or a Pichu to set up and then sat there with immunity while they were asleep, then you could use Yanmega's Linear Attack to do 40 damage to the bench. It meant that you weren't just sitting there not doing anything while those baby Pokemon stayed asleep. And Yanmega was played for a time with Magnezone. Magnezone does big attacks, more on him in a minute. Yanmega attacks for free when you don't need to do the big attacks. Yanmega does the little attacks. When you need a big attack, in comes Magnezone. Yanmega doesn't need energy, so you pile all your energy onto Magnezone. Not to mention that Magnezone allowed you to draw until you had 6 cards in your hand, making it much, much easier to match hand sizes with your opponent. They've got 6 cards in hand, just use Magnezone. They've got 5 cards in hand, use Magnezone and hope that you can play a single one of the cards that you draw. Very nice indeed. But Yanmega was also played with these Stage 1 decks using cards like Donphan Prime or Chinchino or Zoroark, etc. that would attack for a single energy attachment. And then, of course, Yanmega needed no energy. So you'd have a low energy deck with a variety of attackers that served a variety of purposes. In at number 5, Mew EX. Now this is another Pokemon that you could argue is either too low or too high, but he had the Pokebody Lost link. Mew can use the attacks of all of the Pokemon in the Lost Zone, both yours and your opponent's, though you needed the necessary energy. And you even had the attack See Off for a single Psychic Energy, which allowed you to search your deck for a Pokemon and put it in the Lost Zone. Now this was great fun at pre-releases. In my Triumphant pre-release, or one of the ones I actually attended to, I pulled a Mew Prime and a Machamp Prime. I didn't have a Machamp line, I couldn't play Machoke and Machamp and Machop and blah blah blah, but what I did was I used Mew to See Off Machamp, attached a load of energy to Mew and copied Machamp's attacks. Convoluted? Yes. Fun? Oh my goodness, yes. Now, Mew worked as a bit of a toolbox. You would just use whichever Pokemon you wanted that was in the Lost Zone, and often you would combine it with Vileplume to make sure that your opponent was unable to use trainers to get out of it. So let's have a very quick look at some attackers that Mew might use or copy. Relicanth. Using Prehistoric Wisdom for a single energy, choose a card from your hand, put it in the Lost Zone, draw 3 cards. Drawing cards while putting the Pokemon you want to use in the Lost Zone sounds good to me. We could also go ahead and use Vanillux's Double Freeze. Flip 2 coins, 40 damage times the number of heads. If either is heads, they have paralysis. Vileplume means there are very few ways around paralysis, none of that switch or super scoop up rubbish. So you would use Mew to copy Vanillux's Double Freeze. It means that you're attacking with a basic Pokemon rather than a Stage 2. Vanillux as a Stage 2 was slow. Mew was a lot faster. And once you get one Vanillux in the Lost Zone, you can just always use a basic Mew to copy the attack. And let's not forget that V-Flip Victini allowed you to go ahead and reflip, so you had a 75% chance of hitting paralysis and at least 40 damage. And you could reflip if you missed it. You could also use Unpheasant's Fly, 2 energy or a double colorless, 50 damage, flip a coin. If tails, nothing. If heads, prevent all effective attacks, including damage, during your opponent's next turn. I.e. complete invulnerability. And let's not forget that you also had Vileplume, so that your opponent was unable to, later on when they were released, play cards like Pokemon Catcher to get around it. And V-Flip Victini gave you a 75% chance of hitting heads. The final one I'll tell you about is Muck. I've already said you've got Vileplume to block trainers, so you use Muck's Sludge Drag. Bring a bench Pokemon into the active and it's poisoned and confused, which means they've basically got to attack or try and retreat, but you try and bring a high retreat Pokemon into the active and it's taking poison damage regardless and confusion damage if you flip a Tails. Quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, lots and lots and lots of fun. Coming in at number 4, Celebi Prime. Now, Celebi Prime's an odd one because pretty much I've talked about most of the primes from Triumphant. All of the primes from Triumphant, these were the chase cards, the EX equivalents at the time. All of the primes from Triumphant were good, and Celebi was very much the odd one out, quite frankly. Everybody thought Celebi was terrible. He was even released in a boxed product where you got a bunch of booster packs and a Celebi, and everybody complained because Celebi was so terrible that they'd rather have any other prime than Celebi. It got to the point where Celebi was this chase card, which was a $3 card. It was a shiny card, a chase card, a card that you're supposed to want, a card you're supposed to feel happy pulling in a pack, that was less valuable than a pack of cards. And then Mewtwo and Tornadus were released. And CMT, sometimes with Terrakion as well, became one of the very best decks in the format for a little while. It did very, very well at Worlds. Multiple people made top cut at Worlds with it. And it became a really, really, really good deck. So Celebi, you can argue I put it too highly, but really, when you saw CMT and how good CMT was, you've kind of got to acknowledge the power of Celebi. In at number 3, we've got Twins, a supporter card you can only play when you're behind on prizes. Search your deck for any 2 cards. Now, nowadays we have the parallel of Teammates. I even announced it wrong on the German national stream, which is very silly of me. And Teammates is when you've had a Pokemon KO'd the previous turn. Twins is where you are behind on prizes. So you could use things like a baby Pokemon, it gets KO'd, boom, in comes Twins. Or you could use something like an Electrode Prime. Oh no, now I'm behind on prizes. You can actually Twins on turn 1 of the game if you did that, which was really kind of cool. So that was all very, very nice. And there we have essentially an engine for stage 2 decks. What you would do is you would wait for a Pokemon to get KO'd, and then you could go ahead and use Twins to grab a rare candy and a stage 2, something like a Magnezone or a Vileplume. It would really help you set up nicely. In at number 2, Magnezone Prime. And honestly, all of these cards are very much kind of at the top of the list. And I wouldn't really argue about you messing around the order. All of these cards were fantastic and saw a lot of play. I just didn't want to have 1 and 2 as an item card. And this is one of those sets, like Roaring Skies with Shaymin EX. This is one of those sets where there is no dispute. There is a very, very, very clear number 1 card here. So I want to put a Pokemon at number 2, and it is Magnezone Prime. We've already said about the ability Magnetic Draw. Draw until you have 6 cards in your hand. A brilliant consistency boost that helps your deck run very nicely. But that's not the only reason Magnezone is good. Magnezone has Lost Burn. You can put as many energy cards attached to your Pokemon, that's any of your Pokemon, as you like in the Lost Zone. 50 damage times the number of energy cards put in the Lost Zone this way gave you an almost unlimited damage cap, but also completely got rid of the energy for the rest of the game, hence why you would want to pair it with something like Yanmega. Now, there were 2 Pokemon that people used to go ahead and get this Pokemon kind of on the field. One of them was Emboar from Black and White, that just allowed you to put as many fire energy as you like onto your Pokemon, and that was really quite nice because you would put the energy on using Emboar, and then you would discard it using Magnezone. Very nice. The other card that you would see, supporting Magnezone was this Regirock card. It was in fact the Regirock which had Regicycle. It allowed you to discard 2 cards from your hand and then attach a fighting energy from your discard pile to Regirock. And you would see people go ahead and use this to get an extra energy attachment, attach energy to Regirock, just put it in the Lost Zone from Regirock, and then you could just go ahead and do an extra 50 damage. And this combination of awesome ability plus awesome attack puts Magnezone Prime at number 2. But there is no competition here for number 1, ladies and gentlemen. It's got to be Junkam. It's got to be Junkam. Junkam is so good that they reprinted it as Dowsing Machine, which was an ace spec. And you could only have 1 ace spec of any description in your entire deck. And you used to be able to play 4 of them. There was this ridiculous thing for a little while where we had Pokemon Catcher. It's a Lysander, but an item card, so you can play, that and another supporter. And you could play 4 Pokemon Catcher and 4 Junkam in the same deck. You could just go ahead and Catcher every single turn. It was ludicrous. I think you can argue with some aspects of my list, ladies and gentlemen, but if you want to tell me that Junkam was not the best card in Triumphant, we might be having an argument. But you know what? There's a comment section, and that is the right place to have this argument. Go and post some comments. But as always, I want to see your top 10 list. Give me a full top 10. Tell me I'm stupid, tell me I'm wrong, but give me a full top 10. Tell me what you thought of the cards in this set. And of course, there is a like button, click it, you can be my friend. There is a subscribe button, click it, you can be my friend. Or if you've already clicked it but you still want to make me happy and be my friend, then get a friend to subscribe on your behalf. As always, ladies and gentlemen, the most important thing is to look after yourselves until next time. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Ross and you've been watching PTCG Radio.